My name's Ed Robertson. I'm Director of Business Development for JourneyTEAM. We are a systems integrator, an IT systems integrator, and an Okta partner based in Salt Lake City with offices sprinkled throughout the United States. We're going to be getting started here in just a couple of minutes. Today, we're going to be talking about Okta using identity as the foundation for zero trust. So we'll give you about another minute or so for folks to get online and to get organized, and then we'll get things kicked off. A little bit of housekeeping as we start things off. You're going to be automatically muted as you join the webinar here. Just a little bit about JourneyTEAM. As I mentioned, we're a systems integrator. We've been an Okta partner for about the past 3 years, and in 2017, we were surprised and honored to be recognized as one of the top 20 Okta partners worldwide. So we know a little bit about what's going on with Okta. We've done a number of implementations and have worked a lot in the architecture on the systems integration side of things there. With that, I'm going to turn the time over to Kelsey, and she's going to help us out to better understand the role of identity as a foundation for zero trust. So Kelsey, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, and thanks again everyone for joining us this morning. We're looking forward to chatting with you about zero trust. So I think just to kick things off, we wanted to sort of take a step back on zero trust. I think we hear from a lot of organizations that zero trust is starting to enter that buzzword territory. I think, you go around to different security conferences and you start to, play buzzword bingo and see zero trust come up a lot. So it does have a little bit of that feeling there. And similarly, when we talk to customers about zero trust within their organization, there is sort of this reaction from folks who are not in the security or IT team about what do you mean zero trust? You're not trusting me? Explain. And I think that definitely is a challenge that we see, and it's something that we hear a lot when it comes to zero trust. And even when we talk to different security leaders, we ran a survey to better understand where organizations are and if they are approaching a zero trust strategy. And we actually hear only about 16% of organizations have some sort of explicit zero trust strategy. But at the same time, we do hear 97% are engaged in a project that we would identify as a zero trust type project. So while the term zero trust might be entering a bit of that buzzword territory, it does represent a real shift in security and a security mindset, which is why it's something that we wanted to explore with you all this morning. So just to take a step back on what is zero trust, what do we mean when we talk about this term? Really, zero trust is a term that represents this mindset shift in how we approach security. So previously, we had this security model that was really centered on this idea of a trusted network, a trusted ecosystem, usually bounded by a network perimeter that protected all of the resources within that perimeter. So anything inside the perimeter was assumed to be trusted, and anything outside was untrusted. Today there are a few challenges with this particular model. One being that not everyone is accessing resources within that network perimeter. People are accessing, resources from their mobile phones while they're at home, while they're at the local coffee shop, Starbucks potentially. And at the same time too, if someone does get inside that network, then they have unfettered access across your ecosystem. And so really what zero trust is it's a shift away from that network-based perimeter to assume that nothing is trusted. So we can't just assume that anything inside the perimeter is trusted. Everything needs to be assumed to be untrusted today. And so this idea of, quote, zero trust was born in 2009. It's a term coined by John Kindervag of Forrester Research to really represent that shift away from this network perimeter approach to security. And when they first started thinking about zero trust, it was, okay, if we're going to move away from this network-based perimeter, how can we start to segment that down? And this idea of network segmentation became the first sort of approach to solving for this challenge around shifting away from that castle and moat type approach to security. And then as it's continued to evolve, cloud and mobile have really served as a catalyst for continuing to dissolve that network perimeter overall. Right? We have a variety of people now. It's not just employees, but also contractors, your partners, maybe even your customers that need access to a variety of resources, everything from infrastructure to applications and APIs. And all of those things could be cloud-based and they could be on premises. And on top of that, to add to even more complexity here, those resources could be accessed from anywhere in the world. Again, from not just your corporate network, but maybe someone who's traveling, someone, maybe you have a salesperson who's on the road, or you have someone who's working from home. And so the new commonality in all of this becomes really that there is a user that needs to access that resource. And so today, when we think about zero trust, we're really approaching it from this idea of a software-defined perimeter and saying, putting that security around between the identity and the resource they're trying to access. Just to take a pause too, in 2015, this idea, Google brought a similar mindset to their approach to security, which is Beyond Corp. And we do hear Beyond Corp come up a lot in relation to zero trust. And we really see Beyond Corp as the zenith, or this apex of what a zero trust security approach could look like. We kind of highlighted here in this article that Beyond Corp is really taking that idea of assuming the internal network is as dangerous as the internet, so that we can't assume that inside the corporate network is going to be more secure than externally. And so Google's Beyond Corp is this in-depth approach, and really, again, approaching it from an access-based model and shifting away from the traditional corporate network approach to security. Now, at the same time, we hear from a lot of customers, Beyond Corp, that's great. That's definitely a place we would love to be able to do that, but not all of us have the resources to be able to take on this kind of project like Google did. And so how can I, in my organization, start to tackle or start to go down this zero trust type model, wherein we shift away from the network perimeter and start to give access in a software defined approach? And really, that approach is grounded in sort of this core idea, which is that we need to make sure that the right people have access to the right level, have the right level of access to the right resources in the right context. So all of those different pieces around who they are, where they're approaching, where they are, and then make sure that that's being assessed continuously. So we're monitoring and making sure that that person still needs access to that right resource. And if we can do that, then we started to build that foundation for a zero trust model. And I will add something very important to this, that all of this needs to be done with the least amount of friction possible. We all know our end users will try to circumvent the system if all the security controls, if it adds friction to their day. And so how can we make sure that as we're balancing stronger security, that we're doing it in a way that's going to be enabling for our users? So we've started to take a look at what might that look like for organizations, and broken it down into this general architecture. And I know it's a bit complicated of a slide, so we'll spend a little time on this. So again, the idea is really, how do I give the right people access on the left here to the right resources over here on the right? And we bucket that into a few different areas. So it's first and foremost understanding who the user is, the user identity, and also their device identity. So taking those two important pieces of information, and then wrapping all this context around the specific authentication attempt. So is this user in a potentially high-risk user group? Are they an executive? Maybe they're on a finance person trying to access a specific resource. Again, the application at the bottom there of that context, what resource are they trying to access? Is this maybe a sensitive financial system, or what are they trying to access? But it's also pulling in rich context around things like, is this a location that we've seen before? Is this maybe a new city or a geography that they haven't visited from? Is this a network that we're familiar with? What do I know about the device that they're authenticating from? And it's not just the context. That's context that maybe an identity provider can understand, but also rich context from across your stack. So pulling in data from your analytics, and also from we've listed a bunch of partners just as a some examples of where you might be able to pull in that rich context to help us understand what is the likelihood that that identity, that person, is who they say they are. And we feed all of that into this risk engine to give us a probability whether or not this person is who they say they are, and in that attempt to authenticate into a resource. And based on the policies that an organization could set, we could say, okay, if this is a high probability authentication, then let's give them more simple access or more seamless access into those resources. Or if there are maybe anomalous or unusual, that maybe they're authenticating from a network we haven't seen, or the risk score would feed into that probability that this person is who they say they are, we could set a policy that asks them to step up authentication. Or if we're thinking it's a low probability they are who they say they are, then even deny access. And so this is sort of a representation of what that risk score might look like. So again, if it's a high risk login, maybe give them a stronger factor that they need to authenticate from, or even deny access. Medium risk, or even a low risk login, maybe they have a passwordless experience to authenticate. And as a part of doing that risk score, that likely being able to give more seamless access depending on the probability of that user being who they say they are, it becomes this really great model of enabling modern work. And I love this quote from Franklin Rosado, the CTO at Planned Parenthood, where he talks about this idea of zero trust being not only important for security, but also easier for end users. Because if we're able to say that end user is authenticating from, their typical corporate device on the corporate network, then let's not ask them to do several steps of authentication. Let's make it easier for them to authenticate. And so this idea of zero trust really becomes about not only stronger security, but also stronger enablement for your end users. So that's all to say, what does this actually then look like in practice? And we've broken it down into a few steps that we've seen become common across our customers. And so that maturity curve often starts with this beginning, and this is where between stage 0 and stage 1 is where we hear most organizations are today, where they're stage 0 is really more in this fragmented identity idea. So there might be on-prem applications, there could be on-prem directories, and cloud just aren't connected yet, and users have to manage a variety of different passwords, and you're sort of in the beginnings of this journey to move into this zero trust world. And again, we find that about 65% of security leaders don't have yet a unified ecosystem. So again, most organizations are there in stage 0, but as they start to shift into stage 1, that's really where we're starting to unify all of those different systems and give IT and security a single pane of glass to understand what users are accessing and to manage that access. And then on the flip side, we're also making it simpler again for those end users, employees, contractors, partners, to get access in a single interface. Once we have that sort of unified ecosystem, it's then about really adding on that modern multi-factor authentication, which we do hear is the #1 priority from organizations in the coming year. I think it's about 50% of organizations plan to implement MFA in the next month, 12 to 18 months, and nearly 40% are going to be deploying multiple factors across groups, giving that flexibility to determine, again, depending on the riskiness of the authentication and also user profiles, right? Different users may need different types of factors. A hard token versus someone who's on the road may need a different type of factor. One thing I will also call out in this unified IAM step, I guess, a stage here, is that we hear from a lot of organizations the challenge between internal versus external users. So the first step often becomes really bringing in that unified ecosystem for employees, but that challenge becomes a lot more difficult when you start to think about the expanded ecosystem, the expanded enterprise that you also need to manage access to. So how do I also give the same level of control and the same level of security outside of my core user base to my partners or the contractors that maybe aren't a part of my core ecosystem? So once we've kind of managed that component, then we shift into really moving into that idea of how can I leverage the context-based policies and different factors to start to really enrich my security. So it's starting to take that context, again, that we just talked about in the risk-based model. So all those different factors. In this version, the contextual access, typically the first step is starting to set discrete policies. So if we see, these different pieces of context are anomalous, then ask to step up authentication versus that risk score engine, which we'll get to in the adaptive workforce. There's also this challenge around provisioning. So I think this idea around how do I make sure that if an employee leaves, that I am revoking that access quickly and making sure that process is automated. That's something that we hear is a challenge for a lot of organizations. So how can I connect into the system of records? So maybe if that's an on-prem directory, something like AD, or an HR system, how can I automate the provisioning and deprovisioning mechanism for, again, you start to see the discrepancy between not only employees but external users, and start to really take those connections from a core. If someone in HR says this person has now left, how can I automate the downstream flow to remove access from those applications that user was accessing? And again, that challenge just becomes that much more when you have an external user. And then lastly here, once we've gotten through those, then really we can start to get into that more zenith of a risk-based access policy. So not setting discrete policies against specific components of access, but an overall that risk scoring engine that takes in a variety of factors and helps us understand the likelihood based on that user's typical authentication, whether or not that's normal for them or if there are anomalous activities. And we really only see this is definitely something that organizations are starting to work towards, but most organizations again are between stage 0 and stage 1. Less than 10% have reached that sort of passwordless access that zenith. So again, here's sort of that maturity curve laid out here. You can, as we sort of expect, most organizations are going to be starting in between the stage 0, stage 1, as they're adopting more cloud technologies and starting to wrangle all of those different identities, both of their employees, but also that expanded ecosystem, and setting security controls around those, and then shifting up through this maturity curve. And I think, again, why do we want to take identity as the first and the foundation for your zero trust strategy? I would really, I think Melody Hildebrandt of 21st Century Fox calls out that Okta identity was the foundation that could help mature to a zero trust model, is really what I want to leave you with. And why identity again, as we're shifting away from and adopting cloud technologies where people are accessing more resources from more locations than ever before, it really becomes this idea of how do I ensure that my people have access to the resources they need, and that becomes the new security control point. And so that's why we see many organizations going down this path of starting with identity in that zero trust journey. So I hope this was a helpful look at how we're starting to see organizations progress down that path and start to leverage identity in their zero trust journeys. I would again. It definitely, zero trust has been historically has been growing into a bit of a buzzword, but it really does represent this shift that we're seeing across organizations as they're adopting more cloud and mobile technologies. And so that's where I'd love to leave you. And thank you again for your time this morning.
Thanks, Kelsey. Appreciate your time.
All righty. Well,
hey, everybody. This is Nate Pfister. How's it going? Did you enjoy the presentation so far? Any questions? If there are questions, go ahead and type them out. We're actively monitoring this chat screen, waiting for anything that you guys might have questions about. One thing that I wanted to talk about really quick, Kelsey, and follow up to your presentation, just how important this is. In my experience, there's this question of, okay, this is great, and I think most everyone who has attended so far wants to adopt this in their organization, right? But there's a question of cost, and is it worth it? It sounds like a lot of work, and it sounds like something that would be expensive to implement. And if that's the case with you, not you specifically, Kelsey, but with you attendees individually, I would encourage you to reach out to Ed and have him take a look at what your environment looks like and work with Okta to really price it out. The reason I suggest this is actually because we had a client referred to us last week who had a breach of security in their organization, and they came to us and asked for help to tighten things down to make sure that that did not happen again. And this framework that we're talking about today is where things start when you're trying to secure your organization, as Kelsey walked through those different levels of implementation. So don't be scared away by an assumed cost of things. Really price it out and see. Don't roll the dice with your security and your organization. It's not fun to be in the situation that our client was last week.
I would just add to that too. I think we've heard from a lot of organizations as they start on this journey, again, going back to that idea of, we see this Google Beyond Corp, which is amazing, but do we have the unlimited resources of Google? Potentially not. Probably most organizations probably don't. And so how can you start to leverage different components of your ecosystem and begin to go down that journey? I think that there are probably components that already exist, and then other pieces that you can bring together in to begin down that path of how do we mitigate some of the bigger challenges. I think identity, again, we hear, I think it's a Verizon data breach investigation report, over 80% of data breaches are caused by compromised or stolen credentials. And so maybe that's an area that we can start with, and let's knock out with something like an MFA to start to protect against that very common security concern.
Yep, exactly. And I really liked it at Octane this year. I heard the phrase, bad guys aren't breaking in, they're logging in.
Yeah.
And that's really what you see at this point, right? It's less of a hack or an attack, and it's more of a, cool, I got somebody's username and password, and I'm just going to log in and do what I want. And this client that we were talking to last week, that bad guy logged in, enrolled in MFA, because they didn't have those contextual options available to them. And they're not with Okta, by the way. And it was a pretty bad deal for them, right? And there are things that you can do even to protect yourself against that, like no MFA enrollment off of your corporate network and things like that. Just simple things. They don't cost much, but there's something to think about when you're looking at how to secure your environment. And Emily, you did ask the question if the slides will be available at the end. We are recording the presentation, and we'll send out that recording to all attendees at the end, so you can watch this again later and get some more value out of the slides and out of the conversation too.